What's up, everybody? We are talking Circa Million, Week 2 edition. We'll do a quick recap of what went down for our contest entries in Week 1. Then we'll talk about some of the games we are leaning toward, including in our entry for Week 2. Maybe looking at that Minnesota-Philadelphia game in the Thursday night window. If we do want to include that, we're going to have to get those picks in by Thursday afternoon. But let's rewind a little bit, go back to Week 1. We finished 3-2. A solid start, not exactly what we were looking for, especially after going 3-0 in the early window. But we got burned on a couple of games in the late window. We'll talk about those in a moment. But the hits, we hit on the Jacksonville Jaguars, got a friendly number, -4.5 is what it locked in at over at the Circa Sportsbook. And really, for the most part, I think this game played out about as we expected. We saw some pretty significant gaffes by the Jacksonville Jaguars, Tank Bigsby in particular, having a ball go off his hands that nearly turned into a pick six. The Colts punched that in for a touchdown a few plays later. Bigsby, later in the game, has kind of a weird play, not necessarily his fault. Thought he gave himself up. DeForest Buckner able to rip that ball away and run it for a touchdown. So this one was not comfortable really at any point until late in the fourth quarter. Jacksonville just handing the Indianapolis Colts 14 free points. You take that away, even the DeForest Buckner touchdown, I think this one is a lot more comfortable. And it even took a goal line stand by the Jacksonville Jaguars defense, which saw some Gardner Minshew after Anthony Richardson was nicked up late in this game. But we escape with the cover on the Jacksonville Jaguars. They won 31-21 over the Indianapolis Colts. We took a big number, the Ravens, 10-point favorites at home against the Houston Texans. Like Jacksonville, we saw Baltimore get off to a little bit of a shaky start. The offense did not look like it was fully in sync really at any point in this game. Zay Flowers looked fantastic for the Baltimore Ravens. But other than that, it was a clunky debut for Todd Monken helming that new Ravens offense. Now, that was kind of the thought here, is that Baltimore could struggle in this game. And you just have such a huge margin for error when you're playing the Houston Texans with a rookie quarterback on the road in Week 1. We saw rookie QBs go 0-3 straight up and 0-3 against the spread in Week 1. That was a trend that we really liked in this one. So again, like Jacksonville, not a wire-to-wire convincing win for the Baltimore Ravens, but we didn't think Houston would be able to keep up offensively, and that's pretty much how it played out. One of our favorite bets of the week, the one that John and I think agreed on most, was the Atlanta Falcons, 3.5-point favorites. They were over the Carolina Panthers. Rookie quarterback making his first start on the road. Same line of thinking with that previous game, C.J. Stroud and the Houston Texans, Bryce Young and the Carolina Panthers. Falcons eventually, settled in, rode that running game and an improved defense. We saw 2 picks by Jesse Bates of Bryce Young. Those were both huge. And then the Falcons, were able to ride Tyler Algier in the second half to a fairly comfortable win. So we went 3-0 in the early window. We felt great about that. Then the late window arrived, and boy, the Broncos are on probation. This was, if we had to rank them 1 through 5 last week, Denver -3.5 at home against Vegas, that would have been 5 out of 5 pretty easily. The Broncos are on a performance improvement plan until further notice. They cannot be trusted. They will not be trusted. We certainly will not be playing them this week, even though they're at home again against the Washington Commanders. No interest in Denver. To me, they kind of look like the exact same team as last year. Very limited in the passing game, very limited as far as big play options. Denver was able to control the clock early in this game, but without Jerry Jeudy, it just felt like when they really needed a chunk play, there was nobody who could provide that for them. And then the other game in the late window, we saw a few surprising results in Week 1. This, to me, what was the single most surprising, and specifically the second half that the Seattle Seahawks played against the LA Rams. We had Seattle -5.5. And, we started to see this line, once it was locked in, move a little bit toward the Rams toward the end of the week. And, I'm sitting there thinking, oh, wow, this is wild. This is going the complete opposite of what I would expect. It turns out that maybe the odds makers knew something here. The line was simply too good. Seattle just no-showed in the second half. That was about as bad of a second half performance as you're ever going to see. They took their foot off the gas after leading at halftime, could not get anything going against this anonymous LA Rams defense. And, I think with Cooper Kupp out, I don't know if Seattle just didn't take this team seriously or what, but you got to give props to Matthew Stafford, who I think issued a reminder that, he's not a top 5 quarterback in the NFL, but when he's healthy, he's in that top 10 conversation, and he's a real difference maker for the LA Rams. All right, before we get into our leans for Week 2, we got a message from the good folks over at Circa. It's football season at Circa Resort and Casino in Las Vegas, featuring the best pool in history, Stadium Swim, 3 levels, 6 pools, and 143 feet worth of diagonal screen at the pool. Stadium Swim is America's favorite place to watch football. They play every game from college to the pros. I can attest to that. We always stay out at Circa when we go out for our RotoWire trips. They have been fantastic hospitality-wise for us over these last few years. You can catch all the action poolside from a variety of seating options, including cozy day beds, private temperature-controlled cabanas. Those are fantastic. They got little private TVs. It is the best when you're hanging out at Circa Swim, especially if it's on an NFL Sunday. Check out Stadium Swim, located at Circa Resort and Casino. It's open 365 days a year, all sports, all seasons. You can book today at circalasvegas.com. That's circalasvegas.com. All right, let's get into it. Week 2. We are recording this video on Wednesday, a little bit earlier than we normally would be. I'm out of town the rest of the week, so we had to get this one in. Circa lines will lock, of course, later this week, but we're pulling from the Circa Sportsbook as of Wednesday morning. We're starting with the Philadelphia Eagles. They are 7-point favorites at home against the Minnesota Vikings. This is the Thursday night football game, so short week for both teams. Obviously, you don't love the number sitting right at 7. That is a key number, but I love this spot for the Philadelphia Eagles. The Eagles had a terrible game on offense in week 1. There's no other way to say it. You know, they went up early. They got the pick 6. We're up 16-0. And in my mind, kind of shut it down after that. Played really, really conservatively, ran the ball a ton early in the second half, kind of played not to lose. They end up escaping with the cover. Got very dicey at the end thanks to a fumble by Jalen Hurts. And, you know, maybe some of that could be chalked up to the conditions, but this was as bad as this Philly offense has looked really under Jalen Hurts at any point. You know, in terms of EPA, offensive metrics, this would have been Philly's worst game of the entire 2022 season. So I look at that as somewhat of a baseline. You know, you're going up, again, in difficult conditions against a really, really good defense, a really, really good head coach in Bill Belichick and the New England Patriots. I think Minnesota is going to feel like kind of a come down for this Philly team after struggling against New England last week. And you look at the Vikings, oh man, struggled at home in what should have been a plus matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Did not force a single Baker Mayfield turnover. That is difficult to do. Minnesota itself had some bad turnovers deep in Tampa territory that really flipped that game. And you know, it felt like all the luck that Minnesota generated last season, 11-0 in one-score games. It immediately came back around this season. We thought that might be the case, although you know we didn't include that game in our entry. I leaned Minnesota. I was surprised that the Vikings struggled offensively the way that they did. You know, we saw this matchup in week 2 in primetime last season. We know about Kirk Cousins in primetime. There was zero reason to trust him in a spot like this. And we saw the Eagles get back on track offensively in that game last year. They struggled in week 1 against the Detroit Lions and started to look like the Eagles that we came to know in week 2. So I think we see Jalen Hurts settle in. I think we see the new coordinators for Philly settle in. And I think the Philadelphia offense really overwhelms Minnesota here. And, you know, we should note Kenneth Gainwell at this point, he was the RB1 for Philly last week, not on track to play. I don't know if it matters. Philly has 4 backs that they trust. I mean, Rashad Penny wasn't even active in week 1. I think they'll be just fine there. So we like Philly -7 against the Minnesota Vikings. They're at home on Thursday Night Football. Next up, the New Orleans Saints. They are 3-point favorites over the Carolina Panthers. Again, not a great number here. You know, we'd love that to be sitting at 2.5, but I think this is a really good spot for the Saints to kind of catch Carolina in the same way that the Atlanta Falcons did a week ago. I think the Saints defense is better than the Falcons defense that forced a couple of Bryce Young turnovers last week. And, you know, people are maybe a little bit down on New Orleans, had a rocky week 1 against Tennessee, but that defense forced 3 picks on Ryan Tannehill. And I thought Derek Carr, he wasn't great, but he was fine enough, you know, hit Rashid Shaheed on that long 3rd down play to really seal the game for New Orleans. That was the type of throw that New Orleans was not getting out of its myriad of quarterbacks over the last couple of years. So that's where the Derek Carr upgrade comes in. You know, I think, again, we're going to see Carolina be very limited offensively while Bryce Young settles in. I think he's going to be a good quarterback down the road, but I think it's going to take some time. And I don't love the weapons around him, right? We didn't really see anybody step up in that receiving core in week 1. Hayden Hurst ended up being the leading receiver for the Carolina Panthers. That is not necessarily what you want on a week-to-week basis. And injury-wise, no J.C. Horn for Carolina this week. That is a big, big blow. You know, top 10 pick a few years ago. Huge blow for that defense when you're trying to scheme up against Chris Olave and Michael Thomas. Next game that we like, the New York Giants. 5.5-point favorites on the road at Arizona. You know, the Giants stock is about as low as it can be coming out of a 40-0 beatdown in week 1 Sunday Night Football against the Dallas Cowboys. You know, I could still picture Daniel Jones just poor, soaking wet, still in the game with like 2 minutes left. You're down 40-0, just desperately trying to generate something positive. That never really came for the Giants. But I think coming out of that game now, they're a little undervalued, and the Cardinals might be slightly overvalued after hanging around with what looked like a very bad Washington team in week one. You got to keep in mind the talent gap here, right? Like if you stack up the top 20 players in this game, the Giants might have the first 6 or 7. You also have a huge coaching gap between Jonathan Gannon and Brian Dable. Ultimately, I think the Giants are an 8 or a 9 win team. The Cardinals are probably a 2 or a 3 win team. I don't want to overreact to week one. I know it's a long road trip for the Giants going all the way down to Arizona, but I see them bouncing back in a big way in this spot. Next up, we have the Cincinnati Bengals. They are giving 3.5 points at home to the Baltimore Ravens. My guy, John McKechnie, who we do the podcast together, he joined me on this video last week. This is his pick, man. He loves this one. I don't love it quite as much, full disclosure, but he's a Ravens guy. And if he's picking against his Ravens this confidently, I'm willing to hear him out on that. Like I said, I'm a bit more skeptical, especially with this number sitting at 3.5, but you have to believe Cincy bounces back, right? They got their annual clunker in week one out of the way. That was about as bad as that offense and Joe Burrow could possibly look. The passing game by default will be much better. Baltimore down some guys on that defense, and perhaps more importantly, they're without J.K. Dobbins, and they'll likely be without 2 starters on that offensive line. Offense looked a little bit shaky again against the Houston Texans. They will not have that same margin for error this week. So Cincinnati, they're my Super Bowl pick coming out of the AFC. If that's going to be the case, they need to get this show moving, and I think they can do that in week 2. By the way, a good note via the Action Network, teams that lose by double digits in week 1 since 2014, those teams are 39, 22, and 1 ATS in week 2, regardless of the spread. They've also won almost 52% of those matchups straight up. So something to keep in mind there with Cincinnati. All right, we got a bunch of considerations for the last spot, and we might not lock this one in until later in the week. We're looking at San Francisco as a big favorite on the road at the Rams. We're not buying in to this early season Rams hype. I think a lot of the players that popped in week 1, they're going to be on the scouting report going up against San Francisco. This is a vastly better roster, vastly better defense than what the Rams went up against in Seattle last week. I get it. It's a big number, road division game. There are some trends that would push you away from San Francisco here. The Rams look good in week 1, but 49ers also look great. I think they were perhaps the most impressive team wire to wire on both sides of the ball in that win over the Pittsburgh Steelers. That was over, basically a minute into the third quarter. It felt like the Niners could have scored 50 if they really wanted to. My big concern with the Niners last week, the reason I backed off of them, I thought Brock Purdy might be a little rusty, limited during the preseason. No, that was completely out the window. Vanquished all of those concerns immediately. I thought he made some monster throws throughout that game and looked every bit the part of a starting quarterback. So we're leaning San Francisco -8. That's the number at Circa right now for that 5th and final spot. But we'll also consider the Kansas City Chiefs. They are 3-point favorites on the road at Jacksonville. If Travis Kelce plays in this game, I love the spot for Kansas City, especially if this number were to come down to 2.5. I would be jumping all over that. They should have won on opening night. They had a worst case scenario game from the wide receivers. If Kadarius Toney makes any of those catches throughout the game, Cincinnati probably seals that one up, Kansas City probably seals that one up, and we're not feeling quite so bad about Kansas City. And I think we view the Lions differently coming out of that game as well. I thought the KC defense held up really well without Chris Jones. He'll be back in action this week. And then, you look at the Jaguars, struggled quite a bit, especially to run the ball for most of that game against Indy in week 1. I think the Jags put up points here. We have a high total. I think we get a shootout, but I don't trust this Jacksonville defense to slow down Patrick Mahomes. KC also coming in with a major rest advantage in this game, having played on Thursday night last week. The Chiefs, by the way, have not been 0-2 since 2014. It's just almost unfathomable to picture Patrick Mahomes, going into week 3 with an 0-2 record. We're also looking at Buffalo as a big favorite at home against the Vegas Raiders. Pretty obvious bounce back spot, you would think, for Buffalo. Again, a big number. Vegas looked okay in week 1, so we don't love that. But, I also view Monday night as kind of a worst case scenario game for Josh Allen. He's not throwing 3 picks. He's not committing a massive fumble again in week 2. So good bounce back spot for the Bills there. Would also consider Dallas, catching a big number against the New York Jets. 9.5 is the line there. If that one stays under 10, going up against Zach Wilson, yes, we love the Jets defense, but this Dallas team, man, they might be a wagon. They looked dominant in that 40-0 win over the New York Giants. So, as was the case in week 1, we like a lot of favorites here. Not really comfortable with some of the numbers on the dogs, but we'll keep tinkering as the week goes along. And I could assure you, we're staying away from these 3 games: Indy, Houston, Chicago, Tampa Bay, and Washington, Denver. Those will not be on the card this week in the Circa Million contest. All right, those are the picks for week 2. Looking to build a little momentum this week after our 3-2 start. Hopefully we can start hot with that Thursday night football game and go from there. We appreciate everybody tuning in. We encourage you to follow along all season. You can find these videos and our picks on the RotoWire social channels. You can find this on the RotoWire YouTube channel as well. And of course, we want to thank Circa for their ongoing partnership with RotoWire. It's been fantastic. We love staying at Circa every time we head out there for the midsummer RotoWire trip. And I'm looking forward to continuing to do these videos each week and kind of ride this contest out with all the listeners.